Great.
So we'll start with Ted. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, my name is Ted Dennis. I'm chairperson for Voices for Change and a member of LIFT and Poverty. Both organizations engage in political advocacy on behalf of people who are currently homeless, have experienced homelessness, or are living in poverty. This year, among other things, we're going to be working to pass legislation that will automatically expunge unlawful detainers from a person's record after 18 months. In the course of my advocacy, I am regularly reminded of elements of the reNEW Minnesota vision. The overrepresentation of racial and ethnic minorities among those seeking social service assistance highlights the urgency with which we must embrace the politics of inclusion and justice for all and create a fair and equitable economy that benefits everyone. On September 26th, I'm proud to say I was a table discussion leader at the event launching the reNEW Minnesota campaign. All the candidates present then voiced support for the reNEW vision. In fact, I recall that you made reference to a lesson of tolerance you learned from a family member, or the experiences of a family member. So my question to you is that since the day of that event when you voiced your agreement, what have you done to enact the vision, and how have you incorporated the reNEW vision into your campaign?
Well, first of all, thank you all for being here and for giving me the opportunity to come and talk about this. And actually, before the September 26th kickoff, I started talking about a key part of the reNEW Minnesota vision in terms of how we address racial injustice, racial disparity from an educational point of view. Our schools across this state need more funding, and it's something that this governor has been failing to provide in terms of supporting our schools. So there are other candidates in the race who, like me, believe that we have to increase funding for our schools so that all of our children can be successful. But more funding isn't enough of a guarantee that we're actually going to close the achievement gap that exists for kids of color and for low-income kids in this state. We need an additional game plan that works with the schools. We've been asking our schools to compensate for the effects of racism and poverty on kids and on families, and do that all by themselves. They need additional support. So you mentioned housing, for example. We need to have a housing policy. We already spend a lot of money in this state, but we ought to be aiming to spend that in such a way not only that we deal with homelessness, but we also help families be stable so that they and their children can be successful. Moving multiple times during the school year is not a good way for children to be successful in school. So I think getting our housing policy lined up with closing the achievement gap is extremely important for success. Getting our healthcare system lined up with success for kids is extremely important because a healthy family is an essential starting point for the children to be successful in school. And I was talking to a doctor at the Mayo Clinic about this, and he pointed out that besides there being an achievement gap in this state, there's also a health gap. That there are two great disparities in healthcare results and in healthcare treatment for families of color and low-income families. One of the things that he pointed out was that all too often that's a cause of not being educated enough. So there's a deep connection between what we do on healthcare and ways that we're going to help people be healthier and ways that we're going to help them be successful and actually close the achievement gap. And I've been the only candidate in this race who's been talking about closing the achievement gap from the beginning of the campaign to now. So that's my answer. It's not just on September 26th. It was before that.
Let me give you a quick follow-up to add to that, and I would ask that how have you used the vision to distinguish yourself as a candidate?
On that point, let's see. Well, I think that the key thing is being mindful about the racial disparities that exist in this state. And, you know, and I draw on a lot of lessons about this, because another part of the vision is drawing on our life experience. When I was in law school, I represented tenants in New York City public housing projects who were being kicked out of their buildings, and saw the kinds of challenges that families of color face. And after I moved back to Minnesota, I was on the board of a battered women's shelter and had an opportunity to stand up for women and children, those families who were victims of domestic violence. So I've seen that in my own personal experience, and in talking about it, it's critically important that we do something. the part of the vision that talks about what we're leaving our children and our grandchildren, I do not want to leave my grandchildren the achievement gap that we see today.
Number two.
Hi, my name is Kelley and I'm from Champlin, Minnesota. I'm a mother, a domestic violence advocate, and protection organizing leader. Let's see. With all that, and I forgot what you thought. Earlier you talked about education, and that you think that there should be free taxes, or should there needs to be more money in education.
Yeah.
So I recently had a baby, and she's 8 months old, and any of the decisions that you currently make in education would affect her education. Anyway, so my question to you is that will you have the courage to raise income taxes to make sure that she has the kind of education that she deserves?
Absolutely. You know, my own passion too is around how we help every Minnesotan achieve his or her full potential. And when I was the chair of the Senate Education Committee from 2003 through 2006, one of my best days were the days I got to go into schools and see the concentrated potential in those schoolrooms being nurtured by great teachers around the state. So that's what motivates me about being in this race, is making sure that your child and every child in Minnesota has an opportunity to be successful. And we do have to raise taxes in order to do that. And I believe we have to have a progressive tax system that families today, wealthy families today, are not paying their fair share of the cost of providing services in this state. So we need to raise taxes on higher income families. But I also believe that we need other components to the system that can support effective government funding for schools and the other kinds of things that we want to do. So I believe one of the things that we ought to explore in this state is a carbon tax, because it's time to start sending a signal that we should be conserving energy and also reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And it would be an effective way of providing revenue, but also accomplish some other goals that are part of that vision. Because another thing that I don't want to leave my grandchildren, our grandchildren, is a climate that's warming, a planet that's warming. And when you think about translating that to Minnesota, I don't want to leave them a state where they can't go fishing for walleye because we made the lakes too warm, or things like that. So we have to raise revenue in a variety of ways to have an effective tax system, one that's progressive and also one that's more stable. So I think there are several options that we ought to be exploring to make sure that the state has sufficient revenue. I think the other part of the equation, the squeeze on schools, is coming from increasing healthcare costs. In the 2012-2013 budget projected deficit, almost half of that is inflation in healthcare. So I'm looking forward to the opportunity as governor of Minnesota, leading all of us in efforts to reduce the cost of healthcare, not by rationing, but by enabling people to be healthier and keeping them out of doctor's offices and out of hospitals, because we've been successful in actually improving health, not just health care. That'll give us more resources for our kids.